Well, have you a seat now, down there, Bruce Forsyth. I'm about to tell you a tale or two. Well, this one's about Halpin Frayser. As most good things do start. One dark night in midsummer, a man wakened from a dreamless sleep in a forest lifted his head from the earth, staring a few moments into the blackness, said, "Catherine LaRue." He said nothing more. No reason was known to him why I should have said so much. That man was Halpin Frayser. He lived in St. Helena, but where he lives now is uncertain, for he's dead. One who practices sleeping in the woods with nothing under him but the dry leaves and the damp earth, and nothing over him but the branches from which the leaves have fallen and the sky from which the earth has fallen, cannot hope for great longevity. And Frayser had already attained the age of 32. There are persons in this world, millions of persons, and far and away the best persons, who regard that as a very advanced age. Well, they are the children. To those who view the voyage of life from the port of departure, the bark that has accomplished any considerable distance appears already in close approach to the farther shore. Pardon me, I don't know what just happened to me. I just blubbered out a bunch of words. Occasionally I'll do that because I'm reading Ambrose Bierce. That is his name, isn't it? Bierce. Ambrose Bierce. Where were we? However, it is not certain that Halpin Frayser came to his death by exposure. He had been all day in the hills west of the Napa Valley, looking for doves and such small game as was in season. Late in the afternoon, it had come on to be cloudy, and he'd lost his bearings. And although he had only to go always downhill, everywhere the way to safety when one is lost, the absence of trails had so impeded him that he was overtaken by night while still in the forest. Unable in the darkness to penetrate the thickets of manzanita and other undergrowth, utterly bewildered and overcome with fatigue, he had lain down near the root of a large madroño, fallen into a dreamless sleep. It was hours later, in the very middle of the night, that one of God's mysterious messengers, gliding ahead of the incalculable host of his companions sweeping westward with the dawn line, pronounced the awakening word in the ear of the sleeper, who sat upright and spoke, he knew not why, a name he knew not whose. Halpin Frayser was not much of a philosopher, nor a scientist. The circumstance that, wakened from a deep sleep at night in the midst of a forest, he had spoken aloud a name that he had not in memory and hardly had in mind, did not arouse an enlightened curiosity to investigate the phenomenon. He thought it odd, and with a little perfunctory shiver, as if in deference to a seasonal presumption that the night was chill, he lay down again and went to sleep. But his sleep was no longer dreamless. He thought he was walking along a dusty road that showed white in the gathering darkness of a summer night. Whence and whither it led, and why he traveled it, he did not know, though all seemed simple and natural, as is the way in dreams. For in the land beyond the bed, surprises cease from troubling, and the judgment is at rest. Soon he came to a parting of the ways. Leading from the highway was a road less traveled, having the appearance, indeed, of having been long abandoned, because he thought it led to something evil. Yet he turned into it without hesitation, impelled by some imperious necessity. As he pressed forward, he became conscious that his way was haunted by invisible existences, whom he could not definitely figure to his mind. From among the trees on either side, he caught broken and incoherent whispers in a strange tongue, which yet he partly understood. They seemed to him fragmentary utterances of a monstrous conspiracy against his body and soul. It was now long after nightfall, yet the interminable forest through which he journeyed was lit with a wan glimmer, having no point of diffusion, for in its mysterious illumination nothing cast a shadow. A shallow pool in the guttered depression of an old wheel rut, as from a recent rain, met his eye with a crimson gleam. He stooped and plunged his hand into it. It stained his fingers. It was blood. Blood, he then observed, was about him everywhere. The weeds growing rankly by the roadside showed it in blots and splashes on their big, broad leaves. Patches of dry dust between the wheelways were pitted and spattered as with a red rain. Defiling the trunks of the trees were broad maculations of crimson. I get those every once in a while. Maculations of crimson, and blood dripped like dew from their foliage. All this he observed with a terror which seemed not incompatible with the fulfillment of a natural expectation. It seemed to him that it was all in expiation of some crime which, though conscious of his guilt, he could not rightly remember. To the menaces and mysteries of his surroundings, the consciousness was an added horror. Vainly, he sought by tracing life backward in memory to reproduce the moment of his sin. Scenes and incidents came crowding tumultuously into his mind, one picture effacing another, or commingling with it in confusion and obscurity. But nowhere could he catch a glimpse of what he sought. The failure augmented his terror. He felt as one who has murdered in the dark, not knowing whom nor why. So frightful was the situation, the mysterious light burned with so silent and awful a menace, the noxious plants, the trees that by common consent are invested with a melancholy or baleful character, so openly in his sight conspired against his peace. From overhead and all about came so audible and startling whispers, and the sighs of creatures so obviously not of earth, that he could endure it no longer, and with a great effort to break some malign spell that bound his faculties to silence and inaction, he shouted with the full strength of his lungs, his voice broken, it seemed, into an infinite multitude of unfamiliar sounds, went babbling and stammering away into the distant reaches of the forest, died into silence, and all was as before. But he had made a beginning at resistance and was encouraged. So he said, "I will not submit unheard. There may be powers that are not malignant traveling this accursed road. I shall leave them a record and an appeal. I shall relate my wrongs, the persecutions that I endure. I, a helpless mortal, a penitent, and an unoffending poet." Halpin Frayser was a poet only as he was a penitent in his dream. Taking from his clothing a small red leather pocketbook, one half of which was leaved for memoranda, he discovered that he was without a pencil. He broke a twig from a bush, dipped it into a pool of blood, and wrote rapidly. He had hardly touched the paper with the point of his twig when a low, wild peal of laughter broke out at a measureless distance away, and growing ever louder, seemed approaching ever nearer. A soulless, heartless, and unjoyous laugh, like that of the loon, solitary by the lakeside at midnight. A laugh which culminated in an unearthly shout close at hand, then died away by slow gradations, as if the accursed being that uttered it had withdrawn over the verge of the world whence it had come. But the man felt that this was not so, that it was nearby and had not moved. A strange sensation began slowly to take possession of his body and his mind. He could not have said which, if any, of his senses was affected. He felt it rather as a consciousness, a mysterious mental assurance of some overpowering presence, some supernatural malevolence different in kind from the invisible existences that swarmed about him, and superior to them in power. He knew that it had uttered that hideous laugh, and now it seemed to be approaching him. From what direction he did not know, dared not conjecture. All his former fears were forgotten or merged in the gigantic terror that now held him in thrall. Apart from that, he had but one thought: to complete his written appeal to the benign powers who, traversing the haunted wood, might sometime rescue him if he should be denied the blessing of annihilation. He wrote with terrible rapidity, the twig in his fingers rilling blood without renewal. But in the middle of a sentence his hands denied their service to his will. His arms fell to his sides, the book to the earth, and powerless to move or cry out, he found himself staring into the sharply drawn face and blank, dead eyes of his own mother, standing white and silent in the garments of the grave. Allow me a moment to wet my throat, as we're in between parts in Mr. Bierce's tale. Now I can begin part 2 of the death of Halpin Frayser. In his youth, Halpin Frayser had lived with his parents in Nashville, Tennessee. The Fraysers were well-to-do, having a good position in such society as had survived the wreck wrought by civil war. Their children had the social and educational opportunities of their time and place, and had responded to good associations and instruction with agreeable manners and cultivated minds. Halpin, being the youngest and not over-robust, was perhaps a trifle spoiled. He had the double disadvantage of a mother's assiduity and a father's neglect. Fraser Pare was what no Southern man of means is not, a politician. His country, or rather his section and state, made demands upon his time and attention so exacting that to those of his family he was compelled to turn an ear, partly deafened by the thunder of the political captains and the shouting, his own included. Young Halpin was of a dreamy, indolent, rather romantic turn, somewhat more addicted to literature than law, the profession to which he was bred. Among those of his relation who professed the modern faith of heredity, it was well understood that in him the character of the late Myron Bayne, a maternal great-grandfather, had revisited the glimpses of the moon, by which Orb Bayne had in his lifetime been sufficiently affected to be a poet of no small colonial distinction. If not specially observed, it was observable that while a Fraser who was not the proud possessor of a sumptuous copy of the ancestral poetical works, printed at the family expense, and long ago withdrawn from an inhospitable market, was a rare Fraser indeed, there was an illogical indisposition to honor the great deceased in the person of his spiritual successor. Halpin was pretty generally deprecated as an intellectual black sheep who was likely at any moment to disgrace the flock by bleeding in meter. The Tennessee Frasers were a practical folk, not practical in the popular sense of devotion to sordid pursuits, but having a robust contempt for any qualities unfitting a man for the wholesome vocation of politics. In justice to young Halpin, it should be said that while in him were pretty faithfully reproduced most of the mental and moral characteristics ascribed by history and family tradition to the famous colonial bard, his succession to the gift and faculty divine was purely inferential. Not only had he never been known to court the muse, but in truth, he could not have written correctly a line of verse to save himself from the killer of the wise. Still, there was no knowing when the dormant faculty might wake and smite the lyre. That's L-Y-R-E, lyre. In the meantime, the young man was rather a loose fish, anyhow. Between him and his mother was the most perfect sympathy, for secretly the lady was herself a devout disciple of the late and great Myron Bayne, though with the tact so generally and justly admired in her sex, despite the hardly calumniators who insist that it is essentially the same thing as cunning. She had always taken care to conceal her weakness from all eyes but those of him who shared it. Their common guilt in respect of that was an added tie between them. If in Halpin's youth his mother had spoiled him, he had assuredly done his part toward being spoiled. As he grew to such manhood as is attainable by a Southerner who does not care which way elections go, the attachments between him and his beautiful mother, whom from early childhood he had called Katie, became yearly stronger and more tender. And these two romantic natures was manifest in a single way that neglected phenomenon, the dominance of the sexual element in all the relations of life, strengthening, softening, and beautifying even those of consanguinity. The two were nearly inseparable, and by strangers observing their manner were not infrequently mistaken for lovers. Entering his mother's boudoir one day, Halpin Fraser kissed her upon the forehead, toyed for a moment with a lock of her dark hair, which had escaped from its confining pens, and said with an obvious effort at calmness, "Would you greatly mind, Katie, if I were called away to California for a few weeks?" It was hardly needful for Katie to answer with her lips a question to which her telltale cheeks had made instant reply. Evidently she would greatly mind, and the tears too sprang into her large brown eyes as corroborative testimony. "Ah, my son," she said, looking up into his face with infinite tenderness, "I should have known this was coming. Did I not lie awake a half of the night weeping, because during the other half Grandfather Bain had come to me in a dream, and standing by his portrait, young too and handsome as that, pointed to yours on the same wall, and when I looked it seemed that I could not see the features. You had been painted with a face cloth, such as we put upon the dead. Your father has laughed at me, but you and I, dear, know that such things are not for nothing. And I saw below the edge of the cloth the marks of hands on your throat. Forgive me, but we have not been used to keep such things from each other. Perhaps you have another interpretation. Perhaps it does not mean that you will go to California, or maybe you will take me with you." It must be confessed that this ingenious interpretation of the dream in the light of newly discovered evidence did not wholly commend itself to the son's more logical mind. He had, for the moment at least, a conviction that it foreshadowed a more simple and immediate, if less tragic, disaster than a visit to the Pacific coast. It was Halpin Frayser's impression that he was to be garroted on his native heath. Are there not medicinal springs in California?" Mrs. Frayser resumed, before he had time to give her the true reading of the dream. "Places where one recovers from rheumatism and neuralgia. Look, my fingers feel so stiff, and I'm almost sure they have been giving me great pain while I slept." She held out her hands for his inspection. What diagnosis of her case the young man may have thought it best to conceal with a smile, the historian is unable to state, but for himself he feels bound to say that fingers looking less stiff and showing fewer evidences of even insensible pain have seldom been submitted for medical inspection by even the fairest patient desiring a prescription of unfamiliar scenes. The outcome of it was that of these two odd persons, having equally odd notions of duty, the one went to California as the interest of his client required, and the other remained at home in compliance with a wish that her husband was scarcely conscious of entertaining. While in San Francisco, Halpin Frayser was walking one dark night along the waterfront of the city when, with a suddenness that surprised and disconcerted him, he became a sailor. He was, in fact, shanghaied aboard a gallant ship and sailed for a far country. Nor did his misfortunes end with the voyage, for the ship was cast ashore on an island of the South Pacific, and it was 6 years afterward when the survivors were taken off by a venturesome trading schooner and brought back to San Francisco. Though poor in purse, Frayser was no less proud in spirit than he had been in the years that seemed ages and ages ago. He would accept no assistance from strangers, and it was while living with a fellow survivor near the town of St. Helena, awaiting news and remittances from home, that he had gone gunning and dreaming. Part 3. He's a wordy fellow, isn't he? The apparition confronting the dreamer in the haunted wood, the thing so like yet so unlike his mother, was horrible. It stirred no love or longing in his heart. It came unattended with pleasant memories of a golden past. Inspired no sentiment of any kind. All the finer emotions were swallowed up in fear. He tried to turn and run from before it, but his legs were as lead. He was unable to lift his feet from the ground. His arms hung helpless at his sides. Of his eyes only he retained control, and these he dared not remove from the lusterless orbs of the apparition, which he knew was not a soul without a body, but that most dreadful of all existences infesting that haunted wood, a body without a soul. In its blank stare was neither love, nor pity, nor intelligence, nothing to which to address an appeal for mercy. An appeal will not lie, he thought, with an absurd reversion to professional slang, making the situation more horrible, as the fire of a cigar might light up a tomb. For a time, which seemed so long, that the world grew gray with age and sin, and the haunted forest, having fulfilled its purpose in this monstrous culmination of its terrors, vanished out of his consciousness with all its sights and sounds. The apparition stood within a pace, regarding him with the mindless malevolence of a wild brute, then thrust its hands forwards and sprang upon him with appalling ferocity. The act released his physical energies without unfettering his will. His mind was still spellbound, but his powerful body and agile limbs, endowed with a blind, insensate life of their own, resisted stoutly and well. For an instant, he seemed to see his unnatural contest between a dead intelligence and a breathing mechanism only as a spectator, which fancies are in dreams, and he regained his identity almost as if by a leap forward into his body, and the straining automaton had a directing will as alert and fierce as that of its hideous antagonist. But what mortal can cope with a creature of this dream? The imagination creating the enemy is already vanquished. The combat's result is the combat's cause. Despite his struggles, and despite his strength and activity, which seemed wasted in a void, he felt the cold fingers close upon his throat. Borne backward to the earth, he saw above him the dead and drawn face within a hand's breadth of his own, and then all was black. A sound as of the beating of distant drums, a murmur of swarming voices, a sharp, far cry signing all to silence, and Halpin Frayser dreamed that he was dead. The fourth and last part is to come, after a word from our sponsors. I only kid. Oh. Part 4. A warm, clear night had been followed by a morning of drenching fog. At about the middle of the afternoon of the preceding day, a little whiff of light vapor, a mere thickening of the atmosphere, the ghost of a cloud, had been observed clinging to the western side of Mount St. Helena. Away up along the barren altitudes near the summit. It was so thin, so diaphanous, so like a fancy made visible, that one would have said, "Look quickly. In a moment it will be gone." In a moment it was visibly larger and denser, while with one edge it clung to the mountain. With the other, it reached farther and farther out into the air above the lower slopes. At the same time, it extended itself to north and south, joining small patches of mist that appeared to come out of the mountainside on exactly the same level, with an intelligent design to be absorbed. And so it grew and grew until the summit was shut out of view from the valley, and over the valley itself was an ever-extending canopy, opaque and gray. At Calistoga, which lies near the head of the valley and the foot of the mountain, there were a starless night and a sunless morning. The fog, sinking into the valley, had reached southward, swallowing up ranch after ranch, until it had blotted out the town of St. Helena. 9 miles away. The dust in the road was laid. Trees were adrip with moisture. Birds sat silent in their coverts. The morning light was wan and ghastly, with neither color nor fire. 2 men left the town of St. Helena at the first glimmer of dawn, and walked along the road northward up the valley toward Calistoga. They carried guns on their shoulders, yet no one having knowledge of such matters could have mistaken them for hunters of bird or beast. They were a deputy sheriff from Napa and a detective from San Francisco, Holker and Jarrelson, respectively. Their business was man-hunting. "How far is it?" inquired Holker as they strode along, their feet stirring white the dust beneath the damp surface of the road. "The White Church? Only a half a mile farther," the other answered. "By the way," he added, "it is neither white nor a church. It is an abandoned schoolhouse, gray with age and neglect. Religious services were once held in it when it was white, and there is a graveyard that would delight a poet. Can you guess why I sent for you and told you to come healed?" "Oh, I never have bothered you about things of that kind. I've always found you communicative when the time came. But if I may hazard a guess, you want me to help you arrest one of the corpses in the graveyard." "You remember Branscombe?" said Jarrelson, treating his companion's wit with the inattention that it deserved. "The chap who cut his wife's throat? I ought. I wasted a week's work on him and had my expenses for my trouble. There's a reward of $500, but none of us ever got a sight of him." "You don't mean to say—" "Yes, I do. He has been under the noses of you fellows all the time. He comes by night to the old graveyard at the White Church." "The devil! That's where they buried his wife." "Well, you fellows might have had sense enough to suspect that he would return to her grave sometime. The very last place that anyone would have expected him to return to. But you had exhausted all the other places, learning your failure at them. I laid for him there." "And you found him?" "Damn it, he found me. The rascal got the drop on me, regularly held me up and made me travel. It's God's mercy that he didn't go through me. Oh, he's a good one. And I fancy the half of that reward is enough for me if you're needy." Holker laughed good-humoredly and explained that his creditors were never more importunate. "I wanted merely to show you the ground and arrange a plan with you," the detective explained. "I thought it as well for us to be healed even in daylight." "Well, the man must be insane," said the deputy sheriff. "The reward is for his capture and conviction. If he's mad, he won't be convicted." Mr. Holker was so profoundly affected by that possible failure of justice that he involuntarily stopped in the middle of the road, then resumed his walk with abated zeal. "Well, he looks it," assented Jarrelson. "I'm bound to admit that a more unshaven, unshorn, unkempt, and uneverything wretch I never saw outside the ancient and honorable order of the Tramps. But I've gone in for him, and can't make up my mind to let go. There's glory in it for us anyhow. Not another soul knows that he is this side of the mountains of the moon. All right, Holker said. We will go and view the ground. And he added in the words of a once favored inscription for tombstones, where you must shortly lie, I mean, if old Branscombe ever gets tired of you and your impertinent intrusion. By the way, I heard the other day that Branscombe was not his real name. What is? I can't recall it. I'd lost all interest in the wretch. It did not fix itself in my memory. Something like Pardee. The woman whose throat he had the bad taste it cut was a widow when he had met her. She had come to California to look up some relatives. There are persons who will do that sometimes. But you know all that. Naturally. But not knowing the right name, by what happy inspiration did you find the right grave? The man who told me what the name was said it had been cut on the headboard. I don't know the right grave. Geraldson was apparently a trifle reluctant to admit his ignorance of so important a point of his plan. I've been watching about the place generally. A part of our work this morning will be to identify that grave. Here's the white church. For a long distance, the road had been bordered by fields on both sides, but now, on the left, there was a forest of oaks, madroños, and gigantic spruces, whose lower parts only could be seen, dim and ghostly in the fog. The undergrowth was, in places, thick, but nowhere impenetrable. For some moments Holker saw nothing of the building, but as they turned into the woods, it revealed itself in faintly gray outline through the fog, looking huge and far away. A few steps more, and it was within an arm's length, distinct, dark, and with moisture, and insignificant in size. It had the usual country schoolhouse form, belonged to the packing box order of architecture, had an underpinning of stones, a moss-grown roof, and blank window spaces, whence both glass and sash had been long departed. It was ruined, but not a ruin, a typical Californian substitute for what are known to guide-bookers abroad as monuments of the past. With scarcely a glance at this uninteresting structure, Geraldson moved on into the dripping undergrowth beyond. I will show you where he held me up, he said. This is the graveyard. Here and there among the bushes were small enclosures containing graves, sometimes no more than one. They were recognized as graves by the discolored stones or rotting boards at head and foot, leaning at all angles, some prostrate, by the ruined picket fences surrounding them, or infrequently by the mound itself showing its gravel through the fallen leaves. In many instances, nothing marked the spot where lay the vestiges of some poor mortal who, leaving a large circle of sorrowing friends, had been left by them in turn, except a depression in the earth, more lasting than that in the spirits of the mourners. The paths, if any paths had been, were long obliterated. Trees of a considerable size had been permitted to grow up from the graves and thrust aside with root or branch the enclosing fences. Over all was that air of abandonment and decay, which seems nowhere so fit and significant as in a village of the forgotten dead. As the two men, Geraldson leading, pushed their way through the growth of young trees, that enterprising man suddenly stopped and brought up his shotgun to the height of his breast, uttered a low note of warning, and stood motionless, his eyes fixed upon something ahead. As well as he could, obstructed by brush, his companion, though seeing nothing, imitated the posture, and so stood, prepared for what might ensue. A moment later, Geraldson moved cautiously forward, the other following. Under the branches of an enormous spruce lay the dead body of a man. Standing silent above it. Oh, here we go. I apologize. The throat just decided to clench up on me. Standing silent above it, they noted such particulars as first strike the attention. The face, the attitude, the clothing. Whatever most promptly and plainly answers the unspoken question of a sympathetic curiosity. The body lay upon its back, the legs wide apart. One arm was thrust upward, the other outward, but the latter was bent acutely, and the hand was near the throat. Both hands were tightly clenched. The whole attitude was that of desperate but ineffectual resistance to what? Nearby lay a shotgun and a game bag, through the meshes of which was seen the plumage of shot birds. All about were evidences of a furious struggle. Small sprouts of poison oak were bent and denuded of leaf and bark. Dead and rotting leaves had been pushed into heaps and ridges on both sides of the legs by the action of other feet than theirs. Alongside the hips were unmistakable impressions of human knees. The nature of the struggle was made clear by a glance at the dead man's throat and face. While breast and hands were white, those were purple, almost black. The shoulders lay upon a low mound, and the head was turned back at an angle otherwise impossible. The expanded eyes staring blankly backward in a direction opposite to that of the feet. From the froth filling the open mouth, the tongue protruded, black and swollen. The throat showed horrible contusions, not mere finger marks, but bruises and lacerations wrought by two strong hands that must have buried themselves in the yielding flesh, maintaining their terrible grasp until long after death. Breast, throat, face were wet. The clothing was saturated. Drops of water, condensed from the fog, studded the hair and mustache. All this the two men observed without speaking, almost at a glance. Then Holker said, "Poor devil, he had a rough deal." Jarrelson was making a vigilant circumspection of the forest, his shotgun held in both hands and at full cock, his finger upon the trigger. "The work of a maniac," he said, without withdrawing his eyes from the enclosing wood. "It was done by Branscombe. Pardee." Something half hidden by the disturbed leaves on the earth caught Holker's attention. It was a red leather pocketbook. He picked it up and opened it. It contained leaves of white paper for memoranda, and upon the first leaf was a name, Halpin Fraser. Written in red on several succeeding leaves, scrawled as if in haste and barely legible, were the following lines, which Holker read aloud, while his companion continued scanning the dim gray confines of their narrow world and hearing matter of apprehension in the drip of water from every burdened branch. Enthralled by some mysterious spell I stood, in the lit gloom of an enchanted wood. The cypress there and myrtle twined their boughs, significant in baleful brotherhood. The brooding willow whispered to the yew, beneath the deadly nightshade and the rue, with immortelles self-woven into strange funereal shapes, and horrid nettles grew. No song of bird, nor any drone of bees, nor light leaf lifted by the wholesome breeze. The air was stagnant all, and silent was a living thing that breathed among the trees. Conspiring spirits whispered in the gloom, half heard the stilly secrets of the tomb. With blood the trees were all adrip, The leaves shone in the witchlight with a ruddy bloom. I cried aloud. The spell, unbroken still, rested upon my spirit and my will. Unsouled, unhearted, hopeless and forlorn, I strove with monstrous presages of ill. At last the viewless Holker ceased reading. There was no more to read. The manuscript broke off in the middle of a line. That sounds like Bane, said Jarrelson, who was something of a scholar in his way. He had abated his vigilance and stood looking down at the body. Who's Bane? Holker asked rather incuriously. Myron Bane, a chap who flourished in the early years of the nation more than a century ago. Wrote mighty dismal stuff. I have his collected works. That poem is not among them, but it must have been omitted by mistake. It's cold, said Holker. Let us leave here. We must have up the coroner from Napa. Jarrelson said nothing, but made a movement in compliance, passing the end of the slight elevation of earth, upon which the dead man's head and shoulders lay. His foot struck some hard substance under the rotting forest leaves, and he took the trouble to kick it into view. It was a fallen headboard, and painted on it were the hardly decipherable words, Catherine LaRue. LaRue, exclaimed Holker, with sudden animation. Why, that's the real name of Branscombe, not Pardee. And bless my soul, how it all comes to me, the murdered woman's name had been Fraser. There is some rascally mystery here, said Detective Jarrelson. I hate anything of the kind. There came to them out of the fog, seemingly from a great distance, the sound of a laugh, a low, deliberate, soulless laugh, which had no more of joy than that of a hyena night prowling in the desert. A laugh that rose by slow gradation, louder and louder, clearer, more distinct and terrible, until it seemed barely outside the narrow circle of their vision. A laugh so unnatural, so unhuman, so devilish, that it filled those hardy man-hunters with a sense of dread unspeakable. They did not move their weapons nor think of them. The menace of that horrible sound was not of the kind to be met with arms. As it had grown out of silence, and so now it died away. From a culminating shout, which had seemed almost in their ears, it drew itself away into the distance, until its failing notes, joyless and mechanical to the last, sank to silence at a measureless remove. Wow. Every time I go through an Ambrose Bierce story, I think, oh damn, this is some old, lengthy writing. But if I start it, I'm going to finish it, you know. And I'm glad I do, because even though it is pretty wordy, so far, the few stories I've read have been damn good. I don't know what years he was. Oh damn! He was born in 1842 in Ohio. Because I do think about H.P. Lovecraft, who was pretty terrible at dialogue, but this Ambrose Bierce, he knew the difference between that prose and speech. So, late 19th century looks like. Pretty damn good. that time period. "71 years old, 1913. By summer of 1913, he was old and tired beyond his 71 years. He had broken with Hearst and had wrecked most of his personal relationships. Good man. Including that with his brother Albert, who had always been his closest associate and most loving follower. Alcohol and asthma, woohoo, had wretted his once vigorous physique. Boy. At this point, he embarked upon the strange escapade that has has done more to keep his life. I need to stop. Done more to keep his name alive than any of his writings. He announced that he was going to Mexico with a pretty definite purpose, not at present disclosable, quote unquote. He entered Mexico, which was then convulsed in civil war, wrote one vague letter, and then disappeared. With Charlie Ross and Colonel Fawcett, he became one of the great vanishments of the modern world. Interesting after the story I just read. People who cared little or nothing about his writings now found him a fascinating personality. Many books and articles have been written about his fate. What really happened? It is doubtful if we shall ever know. Well, I could certainly speculate. Some say the trip to Mexico was a blind, and that Bierce, under a medical death sentence, simply went off and committed suicide. One ingenious person felt that Bierce had leaped into the Grand Canyon, since this would be the logical place for a giant of American letters to leap. Another writer, even more ingenious, insisted that Bierce had slipped away to England, become an advisor to Lord Kitchener, and died with Kitchener. Nope. Still another theory is that Bierce went to Mexico to invite death on the battlefield. Nope. The prevailing and sanest theory is that Bierce seriously wanted to cover Villa's movements as a war correspondent. Jesus. But died in Mexico in one of the following ways: natural death, or accidental death in battle, or execution because he insulted Villa, I should say. I apologize. Like all other theories, however, these fail for lack of evidence. The perpetual stories of Mexicans who remember the quarrel between Villa and Bierce, or Bierce's burial on the battlefield, invariably peter out into uncertainties when investigated. In any case, the exact manner and moment of Bierce's death are not important now. Why not? Jeez. And then it goes on and on and on and on. Well, that's certainly interesting. And if it wasn't for my alcohol and asthma, my physique might be into reading some more of that. Hell, I can hardly breathe as it is. Give me a moment, please. I never have just read one story, and I'm not really tired. After reading something like that, I want to do something easier and shorter. And I did find a book of, oh dear. Might have to stop pretty soon. But I'll give you a couple of these. Filipino ghost stories. All of these are pretty short. So I'll just randomly skip around. Let's see what we got here. I'll give you about 3 of these. Let's see what are the chapters? The parts. Provincial scares. Blackout tales from the city. Hauntings on American soil. Nope. Let's just go for... Hell, let's do some city stories here. The lower floors. Oop. Never ride the elevator by yourself, especially in the basement. Students at a famous Catholic university in Manila were always admonished with that warning in regards to a particular medical building on campus. Local belief held that a headless nun was haunting the elevator as it reached the lower basement levels. It would appear besides passengers if they dared to venture alone, wearing her nun's veil but with no face or head. The spirit was rumored to have come about from an actual incident. One day, a man was delivering several heavy plastic pallets of soda bottles on a portable dolly to an elevator. As the doors opened, he casually wheeled the dolly inside, not realizing that there was no car there. The doors somehow had opened prior to the car's arrival. The pallets of heavy soda plunged down the elevator shaft, crashing through the ceiling of the elevator car below and killing a nun riding inside. Her head was crushed, and she was summarily decapitated. This spirit now roams the lower floors, appearing next to unwary riders as they descend to the lower floors. Only the foolish didn't heed the warnings, finding themselves next to a veiled, headless passenger. Me and my shadow. Nardo always enjoyed being the class clown. He basked in all the attention by telling jokes to his friends, acting the fool, and even thumbing his nose at tradition. In short, he was doing things others would never get away with, and they were drawn to him because of it. One night, he and several playmates huddled around a candle in the dark. A citywide power blackout had all but shut his district down, and making up games was the only thing left to do to pass the time. They all told stories for a while, but when the flicker of their shadows against the candlelight caught their fancy, they began making shadow puppets with their hands on the nearby wall. "This is an eagle," Nardo said, clasping his thumbs together and fanning out his fingers. His friends then imitated his gesture with their own. "And this is a snake," he continued, curling his middle finger for the pointer finger and opening out his thumb. His friends clapped and showered him with laughter and attention, except for one child who didn't find his behavior amusing. "You shouldn't do that," said Manny, a neighborhood acquaintance. "They say you shouldn't play with your shadow, or something bad will happen." "What are you talking about?" Nardo rebutted. "I can do whatever I want." But Manny was unmoving. "The old people say it's bad to play with your shadow, because someone might get angry and you will die." "Who's going to get angry?" he replied with a smile. "Our grandparents? The shadows? You're dumb if you believe in those old superstitions." He continued his antics well into the night, until the electricity finally came on, and the children disbanded to go home. Nardo casually strolled down his block and noticed his shadow stretching ahead of him beneath the bright street lights that towered above. This immediately reminded him of his earlier behavior, and it would cause him to smile. He would have to do that again very soon. But as he came closer to his house, he stared at his own shadow again and noticed it didn't have a head anymore. He gasped and didn't know what it meant. The following day, Nardo was found dead in his home. On blackout nights, his friends never dared to play with their own shadows ever again. The clothes stay on. Anyone who has ever stayed in the tropics for long can tell you how hot and sweltering the summer nights can be. Many of the older classrooms and dormitories didn't have the luxury of air conditioners back in the 50s and 60s, and given the conservative attitude of most religious institutions back then, sleeping solely in one's undergarments was taboo. But a student named Marisol decided to chance getting caught by the nuns, unable to tolerate the night heat any longer, and decided to wear only her underwear beneath the sheets. But in this particular all-women's dormitory in Manila, there were rumors that the spirit of a deceased nun haunted the building, still enforcing the strict dress code and making sure all the students were abiding by the rules. Unable to brave the heat any longer, Marisol slipped out of her conservative shirt and shorts and went under the covers in only her undergarments. At least it made the night a bit more bearable, and none would be the wiser. But when she woke up the following morning, she was in shock when she removed the covers off her body and found she was fully clothed. That's the end of the story. Oh, man. Alright, one more. That one took me by surprise. Thought there was more to it. Playfully yours. Edward and his 4 siblings all slept together in the same room at night, on the 2nd floor in their house in Manila. It was a simple layout, 2 beds pushed together that were flanked by a black and white television set on one side and a towering detached closet on the other. With the lights turned off, the room was nearly pitch black, with only a crack of the hallway light seeping through the door sill and an oscillating fan to keep them company. It wasn't unusual to wake up in the middle of the night, particularly due to the stifling heat of the tropics. But on one particular night, Edward opened his eyes and saw something mysterious sitting on the top of the closet. It was a little boy, dressed in 1920s clothing, sitting on the edge above him and dangling his feet. It was smiling and laughing. Edward stared back in disbelief. He had never seen a ghost in the house before. He closed his eyes and began praying, hoping the spirit would leave with the power of his faith. He opened his eyes and saw the boy was still there. He pressed his eyes shut and continued to pray. When he opened them again, the little boy had vanished. Edward would later learn that he wasn't the only one who saw the ghost. His mother had seen the same spirit child on a different occasion, wearing shorts, kicking his feet while sitting on the detached closet. Well, if you might give me 5 minutes of silence, as I have no sounds for you at the moment, I don't think. I wouldn't mind coming back. I just need 5 minutes to do a little seance ritual of the dead. Dark. Just things we have to do. I should be more prepared. I used to have sound effects. It wasn't so bad. to go mute for a minute or two. Oh, usually less than that. That's a long time, but you know, a minute. And just leave those sounds a-going, but I just wanted to provide a nicer, look, I don't know what I'm doing. I got no clue. Well, I know partially what I'm doing. I know for the most part what I'm doing, but, yeah. Oh, dear. I don't hear a thing. Oh, my. That's a bit intense. That's not pleasant at all. I'll be right back. Okay. Got a few new things. If they want to come up for me. Oh. Let's see here. Oh, my dear. Guinea pig girl. Exploding Raphaelesque heads. It was in Scotland, of all places, that I saw the painting. Those few months when I was rattling around Europe, cramming in as much culture as I could as if it was about to be rationed to us Americans, or the world was coming to an end and this would all be rubble, while we were dust. It was in the Scottish National Gallery in Edinburgh, a big grey temple-like building with imposing pillars, which sat at the bottom of a small hill they called the Mound, below the old houses that stretched up and down the Royal Mile from the castle to the palace down at the other end. I came round the corner, eyes drifting between the brochure in my hand and the paintings on the wall, when suddenly there it was, a section devoted to Salvador Dali. Although they didn't have much in the way of exhibits, and things started with various black and white photographs of the man himself, taken at different times during his life. But all seemed to show him with wide eyes and eyebrows raised, either in a questioning or condescending pose. In many, his mustache was tapered to 2 deadly points. One photograph showed these points skewering 2 flowers. In another, they were curled upwards, climbing over his cheeks, ready to impale his eyes. In some photographs, he was standing beside famous people. I recognized Harpo Marx, Alfred Hitchcock, Sonny Bono, John Lennon, even Raquel Welch, Alice Cooper. It was obviously a bit of a thing to have your picture taken with Dali, but I have to confess that I didn't recognize Coco Chanel, although the little card below the photograph told me her name anyway. Sadly, the Rhino Dali was almost kissing in one photo seemed to go unnamed, like the headless mannequin he carried in another shot, as if the jointed dummy was his dead robot bride from a bad 50s B-movie. My kind of stuff. Walking on, the blizzard of photographs ended, and the small exhibition started with his painting Oiseau, or Bird to You and Me. What was it about? It looked like a skeletal remains of a dead bird, almost prehistoric, decaying on a beach, with part of the body missing to reveal the corpse of a young bird inside. Then there were a couple of sketches of things that looked like skeletons adorned with various pieces of meat, entrails, sausages, steaks and cuts. Next came a storyboard for a proposed film on surrealism and a proper painting called Le Signal de l'Angoisse, The Signal of Anguish, depicting a woman who was naked, except for a pair of stockings, standing in a strange landscape being watched by someone you couldn't really see through the square window of the building behind her. It was disconcerting. It was creepy. It made you stop and look back at the painting to see if the watcher had stepped forward, revealing themselves. But no, they always stayed in the shadows. And that was good. That was something out of left field, which couldn't be topped. Or so I thought, but I was wrong. They had kept the best for last. Kept it for me. Because it changed my life forever. Take Raphaelesque éclaté. Exploding Raphaelesque head. If you don't know it, Dali's painting was inspired by the bombing of Hiroshima. Uses a classic Madonna-like pose typical of the Renaissance artist Raphael, but has the head fragmenting. Some of these fragments look like pieces of twisted silver. Flesh turned to metal, possibly transformed by the alchemy of nuclear forces, while the splitting parts around her neck are darker, almost stone-like, but in strange, sharp, conical, wriggling shapes that resemble shapes seen in some of Dali's other work. This may be a painting depicting the instant after the explosion, still head-like before it shatters in 1,000 different directions as the woman looks down, demurely, almost in prayer. I couldn't take my eyes off of it. I stood staring, oblivious to the other people who flowed behind me. I tried to get in front of me for a better look, but I denied them with my closeness to the canvas. Eventually, after several minutes had passed and my eyes had finished taking in every square centimeter of the canvas, I snapped out of my reverie and spoke to a member of the gallery staff. I made some vague, rambling inquiries about buying the painting, which were instantly laughed off until I insisted I had the money to buy it if they named their price. That received a more hesitant, less certain laugh, which attracted the attention of some security staff who stood in the corners, hands behind their backs, watching my every move until I went to the shop in the gallery. There I bought all the books I could find with Dolly's work in them. They even had a few tacky products inspired by the very painting that dominated my thoughts. A jigsaw, a tea towel, various notebooks, shopping bag. I've added a few tacky products of my own over the years, all with a production run of one. Some I've commissioned from other artists, some I've made myself. If you ever come to my house, which is admittedly highly unlikely, you will see 2 walls covered in a reproduction of that exploding head. It also adorns my bedroom ceiling. I try to make it the last thing I see at night and the first thing I see in the morning, keeping my eyes firmly closed until I'm in position to gaze up at it. I'm a weirdo. But all these things, they are never enough. After I had made my mind up, after I had foolishly thought I was ready, my first subject was male, in his 30s, found sleeping rough beneath the pier. What was I thinking about? I almost died. He spat at me as soon as I took the tape off his mouth. Struggling violently in the chair I had tied him to, trying to rock from side to side before he fell over. I've seen enough movies to know if that happened, he would break the chair and be on me. I thought I could get the grenade into his mouth when he was shouting. It wouldn't fit. And I'd already pulled the pin. We both had about 5 seconds. I dropped the grenade under his chair, dived behind one of the blast walls I had constructed in my special studio. There wasn't much left of him. And what was left wasn't pretty, and was, well, everywhere. Wrong, 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 and I thought my eardrums had burst with the noise. That's a demented story. My second subject was a homeless man. This time things went slightly better. I drugged him, took out all his teeth with the help of a hammer and some pliers, and managed to squeeze the grenade into his ruined mouth in plenty of time, especially with the pin protruding outwards. Still, what a mess. Grenades were clearly not the answer, but at least the money I splashed on state-of-the-art earplugs connected to a digital processor was money well spent. My third subject was a male hitchhiker. I killed him first. How? Well, that doesn't matter. But it was better that he was dead, as I had started to experiment with different kinds of explosives and wanted to make things as simple as possible. This time I used ammonia gelatin, placed in the mouth. Again, messy, but not without potential. The fourth subject was an old beggar and an old boozer, too. I used Simtex this time, obtained from shadowy context of a guerrilla artist I know. This time I tried a different, more ambitious place to put the explosive, namely inside the skull. I should have been a surgeon instead of the third waster son of a logging tycoon. I'm good at this. I shaved some of the old man's hair off before peeling back the scalp and sawing through the bone, and then again and again at different angles until I was able to pull out a rough circle of skull before removing part of the brain. Too much Simtex was an obvious beginner's mistake, and I also noticed that I needed to remove more of the brain in future. By now, I learned all I could from the men. I didn't need them anyway. They were just practice. Dolly's painting is the fragmenting head of a woman. Killing these male subjects first had made things easier from a planning and preparation point of view. But from now on, it was going to be women only. And they would all be dead if possible. At peace, serene, Madonna-like. The fifth subject was my first female. And my brilliant idea was to try and take the top off her skull out from inside her head. Check my numbers. And make it easier to explode and come apart. It took hours to achieve anything like the desired effect, leaving me exhausted with another mess on my bloody gloved hands. What was there before the explosion didn't even resemble a head very much. So you can imagine what was left afterwards. From now on, the skull would have to stay. My sixth subject was a drug addict, and I went back to basics with a hole in the top of her head and a slightly lower amount of plastic explosive. Not enough for the desired effect, but getting there. A woman possibly in her early 30s was my seventh subject. It was hard to tell her age. She clearly had it tough by the state of her, so in a way I was doing her a favor. I picked her up by the old bus station. Sadly, I overcompensated with the explosive charge, and her head sort of imploded. Collapsed in on itself, totally the wrong result. Possibly due to where I placed it within her skull. I would need to do much better next time. Now it was time to go up a gear. Time to find a different sort of woman. 3 at most, I hoped. 2 to practice on. The third would be the charm. Sad but true. And I'm not being insincere, not really. But none of my female test subjects so far could be classified as lookers. Not after the drugs and booze and the abuse have worn them down. 2 out of 3 have had broken noses, and all have had cheeks riddled with broken blood vessels. Riddled! Victim number 8 was a high school beauty, and a real test of my mettle. Her youth and good looks gave her some of the qualities of the subject in the Dolly painting, which was strangely off-putting. What a set of lungs she had as well, constantly screaming the place down. Even though my place is out in the country, and my studio well hidden within the depths of the estate, I still kept her drugged at the end. Glued her eyes shut, puffed up her lips slightly with collagen filler. She was almost perfect. Almost. 9th victim was me being really stupid, acting on impulse after finding a woman at the side of the road, trying to get her car to start. Anyone could have come along and seen us. Anyone. What an idiot I can be at times. Although I did care to push her car down one of the old forest tracks and saw it tumbling between the trees toward the old lake where it should be rusting at the bottom. I was also pleased to note the similarities to the Dolly painting when I slowed down the film I've been taking of all my explosions. Slowed it down almost frame by frame. The incandescent, Hiroshima moment. For my 10th victim, I scoured a lot of online model agencies till I found the ideal woman to hire, being very careful to cover my tracks for when she was inevitably reported as missing. That face, that nose, those lips, they hardly needed filler at all. As for the curve of her eyebrows, well, it was divine. The hair wasn't, of course, but still, you can't have everything. Crucially, her hair was longer than I needed it to be, but I still had to be very careful when I cut it, very careful when I styled it. I wasn't even really sure if she needed to be alive when I did all that. Not being sure, I thought it better to drug her, then wash and cut her hair. Shame I had to cut into her scalp to plant my little charges. Now it is perfect. She is perfect. Head and neck severed from her body, carefully mounted, drained of blood. Lips perfectly full, eyes closed, head angled downwards. Hole cut out at the top of the head with an angled light source shining down from above. I know the angle isn't going to mirror Dolly's exactly, but I don't want anyone to see the Simtex placed inside her. Now there are 6 cameras pointing at the head, one from each side, one from above, one slightly below, looking up as she looks down. Dolly would be proud of me. Well, that took me by surprise. Oh, I meant to say that was Exploding Raphaelesque Heads by Ian Hunter. Let me see if I want to do one more. Never know where these are going to go. Like I said, other dark tales. Excuse me. Let's see. Biofeedback by Gary Fry. Not quite sure what I'm getting into here. I guess this is all part of the story. The following author biographies have been extracted from selected editions. I was lucky to this is from a book entitled Best British Horror 2014. The last one I was lucky was the point of view of an American. I don't think I'll be lucky twice in this book, so I hope you'll apologize to me for this voice not working. And I will be awaiting said apology forthwith, in however manner you see fit. The following author biographies have been extracted from selected editions of the annual Anthology Year's Best Spooks, edited by Simon Jackson. They are presented here with no editorial modifications. Extract from Year's Best Spooks 2012. Gordon Franklin lives in Leeds with his wife Harriet and their two young children, Nadia and Toby. Fans of ghostly fiction need little introduction to Franklin's work. His frightening first novel, Truth Twice Removed, was a supernatural treat and won a stack of awards the world over. And so we're delighted to welcome him to this, his first appearance in Year's Best Spooks. Despite the nature of his work, Franklin claims to be a skeptic about the other side. He writes, "I find the supernatural genre imaginatively appealing in an emotional sense, but it's certainly vulnerable to intellectual analysis. Its power, I think, derives from its ability, when done well, to peel away rationality. Under its surface, life is disconnected fragments, and that frightens us. And ghosts can serve as powerful symbol for that fundamental uncertainty. What follows is a creepy tale, some might say, lays waste to the author's skepticism. The story came to Franklin, as often the case, in the form of a playful idea. I've long been drawn to the notion that a living man can become a ghost to others on the basis of negligence, or perhaps as a result of detached tyranny. Well, that forms the core of this story. The absentee factory owner hunting his staff is based loosely on a guy I used to work for before my writing became successful. Christ! Never let it be said I haven't earned my right to make some money out of this game." In his mid-30s, Franklin likes cigarettes, fine food, drink, and, when he's not writing, walks with his family. Extract from Year's Best Spooks 2013. Gordon Franklin lives in Leeds with his wife Harriet and their two young children, Nadia and Toby. Franklin's second supernatural novel, Lot's Mirror, more than fulfilled the promise of his first, the genre-defining Truth Twice Removed. Indeed, we at Year's Best Spooks predict big things for this author, and that's why we're delighted to see him back in our annual anthology. Another reason is that he tells one hell of a scary story, and the one you're about to read is no exception. Franklin writes, "On the strength of sales of my novels, I recently quit the day job. Lord never put me in a classroom again, and moved into what me and the family consider our dream home, a lovely, secluded 17th century property in North Yorkshire. And does this place have ghosts? I hear readers ask. Well, I'm afraid to say that despite my wife and kids reporting a few spooky incidents, I personally encountered nothing that cannot be accounted for by reason. Which is not to say the house isn't a source of inspiration. Solitary walks and the surrounding countryside have done much to stir my creative juices. And now I have enough dark material under development to inform years of work. I think fans of supernatural fiction will agree that in the tale that follows, Franklin shows little sign of losing of his touch. Its ruthless narrative about a man haunted by a former owner of his new home with a penchant for liquor is incongruously powerful in its brief span, and hints at more of the novel-length fiction we crave from this sterling new master of terror. Extract from Year's Best Spooks 2016. Gordon Franklin lives in North Yorkshire with his wife Harriet and their two children, Nadia and Toby. It's been a while since we welcomed him to the pages of Year's Best Spooks, and that's because he's been writing a number of increasingly popular supernatural novels, After showing early promise in Truth Twice Removed and Lot's Mirror, Franklin has published Still Waters, The Family Man, and Nothing Changes. All well received by readers and critics alike. Nevertheless, it troubles him that certain sections of the supernatural community, originally defenders of his work, have recently accused him of selling out. Franklin writes, "Any fool knows that commercial success involves concessions to markets that pre-exist the artist. Hell, I worked long enough in the real world to realize that life is often about compromise, especially when economic survival remains so challenging. It's my working class background, much of it spent in the mean streets of Leeds, that makes me fond of fast cars. I also have a family to clothe and feed. So come on, guys, give me a break here." Fighting words, we must surely agree. Indeed, Franklin has lost little of the boozy rage that fueled his early fiction. By way of illustration, witness the following tale. On doctor's advice, I recently quit smoking, Franklin explains. And that involved a month of hell for me and others. I found myself feeling intolerant of many things, even my wife's beliefs, unsuspected until this stage of our marriage, in the supernatural. This got me thinking about psychological demons. Imagine a guy so vehemently denies the existence of a ghost haunting his partner that it shifts its attention to him. The tale you're about to read, dear readers, shows that commercial success has done little to dull Franklin's sinister disposition. He remains as exquisitely warped as ever. Extract from Year's Best Spooks, 2019. Gordon Franklin lives in North Yorkshire with his wife Harriet and their two children, Nadia and Toby. Since his last appearance in Year's Best Spooks 3 years ago, Franklin has moved away from his supernatural genre, writing crime novels in an attempt, he candidly admits, to remain afloat in a market unsympathetic to his previous fictional focus. Nevertheless, despite rumors of its death, we at this annual anthology believe that our field is in rude health, and we offer this latest collection as proof. Unsurprisingly, Franklin's story is one of the strongest offerings. We can only assume that the tale, a harrowing depiction of marital and paternal abuse, is based on Franklin's childhood, which he's alluded to in many frank media interviews. His depiction of a husband and father haunted by a brutal, ale-enraged ancestor is a bold attempt to understand an abuser's behavior from the outside. Perhaps it's time for Franklin to address these issues. We know from public statements that his father, from whom he'd been estranged since teenhood, died recently. In an interview earlier this year, Franklin said, "Despite my contractual commitments with the novels, they alone pay for petrol and put food on the table. I've never lost my love for short stories. They offer me the opportunity to take risks, to dig a bit deeper into life." When asked about his infamous skepticism concerning the afterlife, he added, "As I get older, I become less certain about many things, and the supernatural is one of them. Let's just say I'm more open-minded now than I was even a decade ago." Extract from Year's Best Spooks, 2021. Gordon Franklin lives in North Yorkshire with his wife Harriet. Fans of genre fiction will realize that this has been a demanding one for the author, and we at Year's Best Spooks don't intend to add media speculation about the challenges he and his wife have faced. Needless to say, we wish them both well during this period of recovery. and hope in inclusion of a new story by Franklin in our latest anthology is a way of supporting them. Not that the tale doesn't earn its modest fee. It's often said that writers' best work comes from duress, and that certainly holds true here. One wonders whether Franklin's latest novels, alluded to in rare interviews, have also returned to the frightening territory of his earlier work. We can only hope a publisher snaps them up soon. In the meantime, we have this treat to savor, and it's one that seems more autobiographical than Franklin's usual portraits of haunted men whose circumstances are quite removed from his own, formerly idyllic lifestyle in North Yorkshire. The central character likes fast cars, hard liquor, and even psychotherapy. One might say he's racing from his past, and his sudden shift from gad about town to a cripple's terror is certainly disturbing. Perhaps the cocky ghost of a man killed in the same crash that disabled the carer's wife serves as Franklin's attempt to castigate the person he once was, arrogant, rash, intolerant. Understandably, Franklin didn't reply to emails asking for comments about this piece, but he made a telling statement in the last interview he gave before suffering his familial tragedy. All of us haunt. We haunt everyone around us and the places we occupy. We are all ghosts. Extract from Year's Best Spooks, 2026. Gordon Franklin lives in Leeds with his wife Harriet. Life hasn't been kind to the author, especially when, half a decade ago, his 2 children were killed in a car accident that also involved his wife. Franklin alone, driving the fast vehicle, escaped the flaming melee. Unpublished for several years, the author now lives back in his native West Yorkshire, caring for his disabled wife on a full-time basis. It's a tragic story as unsettlingly heartbreaking as those with which he once thrilled a generation of genre fans. Nevertheless, this forgotten man of supernatural fiction has never been less than surprising, and imagine our delight at Year's Best Spooks when during our 25th anniversary we received a brand new submission from this living legend. And if it isn't one of the most horrifying pieces we've ever had the pleasure to read. As usual in Franklin's last few contributions to this anthology, the author was unavailable for commentary, and so we must let the tale speak for itself. One thing that will strike readers familiar with his work is the shift from his characteristic third-person narrative to the more intimate first-person. We think this lends the fiction much more power, but Franklin's depiction of a drinking man haunted by past shadows that darken his path is as subconsciously accurate, analytically dispassionate, and unwittingly illuminating as anything he wrote during his all-too-brief professional career. The demons on the fringes of consciousness now take center stage in what the author might once have described as the nebulous mind. And so let us raise the spotlight of our mind's eye, unblinking, obsessive, moist with unquenchable grief. Behold. Extract from Year's Best Spooks, 2029. Gordon Franklin lives in Leeds. That's pretty much all we know about this reclusive author. The return address for e-payment that accompanied the story you're about to read was of a street full of tenements in a rundown area. We understand that the author's wife has recently died, following medical complications. The only other clue about Franklin's circumstances on the note attached to the following tale was a single enigmatic message I was wrong about many things, but wrong about this especially. And does he refer here to the supernatural? That certainly seems plausible, particularly after reading the following piece, Franklin's first fictional output since his last contribution to Year's Best Spooks. But is this fiction? That's the question readers will surely ask themselves. The setting seems authentic. The house the author once occupied in the splendid Yorkshire countryside. But the time is all wrong, because the spooks that haunt this latest abusive alcoholic in a Franklin tale could never have existed there. That was once a happy family home, and this is no happy family. We speculate that Franklin, struggling as a result of hard experience, regular drink, and a twisted state of mind, could be planning an autobiography and has simply got some details wrong. The ghosts surely belong elsewhere, where the author now lives in a dilapidated city. Nevertheless, these creatures are no less frightening for their tranquil rural location. They make one believe, as we at Year's Best Spooks have always believed, as even Gordon Franklin, once such a wry skeptic, has possibly come to believe that the supernatural is real. We hope that you, dear readers, also share this sentiment, and so turn the page and lapse again into Franklin's world. He might never have been more frightening, nor have created such potent beings. The vicious behavior of the two vengeful children, and perhaps worse, the hideously mangled wife, contain an element of autobiography, of unforgiving accuracy, of experienced horror. Gordon Franklin is a haunting and haunted man, and we hope he gets by.